Hi everyone, this is Matthew Janner for Card Runners, and I'm here with out of position 3-bet pot flop play part 3, where we're going to be analyzing cutoff versus button situations. So today we're doing cutoff versus button play. Cutoff open versus button 3-bets is probably the most common spot to play a 3-bet pot out of position other than blind play. This used to be especially popular a couple years ago, but people have since learned that you really need to be 3-betting aggressively out of the blinds. So people don't recommend 3-bet as aggressively in the button against a cutoff open as they used to, but it's still very common where you open the cutoff and you face a 3-bet. Here, we'll probably 4-bet most of our strong but vulnerable hands pre-flop, such as kings and jacks and ace-king, as well as the appropriate amount of bluffs. In other words, we'll likely 4-bet a polarized range. So before we design our cutoff flatting range against a button 3-bet, which I'll talk about in just a minute, just know we're going to be 4-betting a very polarized range. That shouldn't really be that surprising. If our opponent 3-bets us, we want to 4-bet them with the really good and vulnerable hands like kings to jacks and ace-king, as well as some bluffs. It is important to remember that pre-flop ranges are constantly tweaked after doing post-flop analysis. I'm going to start with what I think is a reasonable out-of-position 3-bet calling range, but feel free to pick something different. I don't know the correct answer here. No one does, but theory can be used to estimate what the correct ranges are. In other words, we use theory to get a general idea for what can be correct pre-flop, then we take a trial and error approach and tweak the pre-flop ranges. I'll briefly describe the ranges, then we'll jump in. I'll probably recommend a few tweaks after making a couple of videos on this topic. Alright, so starting off, this is the range that I'm going to be using as the button 3-bet versus a cutoff open. It's 8.5%, which seems reasonable. And if you'll notice, the value component is sort of the jacks to aces, the ace-queen suited, and the ace-king. And then we have just a bunch of, reasonable bluff-type hands. So, in theory, you're not always probably going to 3-bet ace-king preflop or 3-bet aces preflop, and you're not only going to randomize with these types of bluffs, but it is going to give us a general idea of what the button 3-betting range looks like. And the actual theoretically correct ranges would use tons of, fractions of certain combos and stuff like that, which we, of course, can't know the answer to and isn't even worth going into. So just be aware that we have an 8.5% button 3-betting range. And if you prefer to 3-bet bluff some other hands rather than these, that's fine. Some people might want to call with a king jack off, queen jack off. Others might even want to just 3-bet the ace 10 off if they don't flat it. It's not going to be a big deal. The one thing you really want to take note of is when our opponent 3-bets us from the button and we call on the cutoff, all these hands that he's bluffing with, they're pretty good hands. Like, queen jack off, king jack off, ace 3 suited, ace 6 suited. All those hands can flop reasonably well. So we're going to have to defend quite aggressively in the cutoff when we face a 3-bet from the button because he has pretty good bluff randomizers and the advantage of position. So here is the cutoff opening range that I have. So 24%, which seems reasonable. You can make it a little bit more aggro if you wanted, not a big deal. But this is what we have as the cutoff opening range. And then I think what you're usually going to want to do is you're going to want to 4-bet around 5% of the time. So we can say, so we start off with 23.7%. Let's say we 4-bet this stuff right here. Well, we can keep the 10s. So we want to maybe go down to like 19% or something like that. So maybe we 3-bet bluff some suited aces, which aren't going to call, something like that. It's not a big deal. So just know you're going to have some 4-betting range of around 5%, give or take. It could be even a little bit tighter than that. And then I just took out some suited aces, suited kings. You're going to want to, 4-bet bluff with the hands that you're not calling with that you think is the best. Suited aces, suited kings have a lot of equity and good removal effect. Another option other than suited aces or suited kings would be to bluff with some of this kind of stuff if we're not calling. Again, it's not hugely important. Now, in addition to us 4-betting ourselves, remember the blinds are going to 4-bet cold sometimes. So they're also going to help us defend against the button's 3-bet. And once again, just to make it abundantly clear, the hands that I marked, I'm not saying those are the theoretically correct 4-bets. Again, you would use a whole bunch of different hands. I was just clicking stuff to show you hands that are reasonable to 4-bet bluff. Ace 10 off and stuff works fine too. All right, so we're going to 4-bet, let's say 4.5 or 5% of the time out of the 24 or 25% of the time we open. And now we need to develop the calling range. So I would start with cold calling aces because aces aren't really vulnerable to any of the hands the opponent's 3-bet bluffing in the button usually. So, aces can get outdrawn on the flop usually by like pocket pairs. The opponent's just not all that likely to 3-bet bluff a pocket pair. And if the board does come a board which adds a lot of coordination, we might be check raising all in or on the flop or on the turn before our opponent can really outdraw us with his suited connectors or suited gappers cheaply. So just be aware that aces usually make a very good slow playing hand because if we have aces, our opponent's going to be probably a little bit more likely to be bluffing because we have a good removal effect. But in addition to that, aces just aren't that vulnerable to being outdrawn on the flop. Okay, so let's just go ahead and start clicking stuff, the stuff that I want to keep. So let's start off with going something like, let's see how something like this looks to begin with. So I'm getting rid of the suited connectors. We might end up calling with a few of them, but let's start with clicking something like this and seeing how many hand combos that is. So if we call 8% and we 4-bet like 4.5 or 5%, we're defending about half of our range. And in addition, the blinds are going to 4-bet sometimes themselves. So rather than to assume 3-bet sizing and do all these calculations, hopefully you've seen enough other videos or read the book that I wrote, and you know sort of how to do this calculation to figure out exactly how much money the button's paying to see a flop. So you can tweak this range to make it tighter or looser as you see fit. I'm going to make it a little bit wider and just add an ace-9 suited. But for the most part, this looks like a reasonable starting point to start playing around with these types of ranges. So I plugged both the 3-betting range, which is on the top, and then the cutoff flatting range, which is on the bottom, and found both of them have about 50% equity when I plugged them into PokerStove. So that seems reasonable since the cutoff's getting a really good price by calling. The button usually 3-bet reasonably small to be sure he can utilize his positional advantage. But the button also has a better distribution of equity since he has, a more polarized range with more premium hands, and he has the advantage of position, which will be quite significant since there's still a decent amount of stack depth, especially if the button 3-bets small. So again, this seems like a reasonable starting point to me. I'm not going to repeat all the theory we've talked about in other videos. And then since it seems like a reasonable starting point, we'll jump in and then we'll tweak the pre-flop ranges after we play around with some flops because we're dealing with a very non-solvable spot. All right, so let's generate our first flop. Okay, so the first flop comes 9 of spades, 7 of hearts, 6 of clubs. So the first thing that I noticed about this flop is, as I talked about in the other videos, we might want to try to defend like 65 or 70% of the time on the flop. This is going to be very hard, if not impossible, to do here because the board came 9 high. So let's go ahead and plug the board into PokerStove. So for the nits, we'll get the right suits. But I imagine our bottom range, which is our cold calling range, which has 50% equity before we see a flop, I imagine it goes down in equity here. Oh, it actually doesn't change. So that's something to know. I was expecting it to have less equity than it apparently does. But even then, it's still going to be hard to probably defend on this board because we don't have the right type of hands that really check call very effectively. And we're out of position on a board where position's incredibly valuable. Hopefully everyone that's watching this video, since this is going to be a pretty difficult video, but hopefully everyone understands how position's very, very, very valuable on this board texture. So we have 105 combos. We might try to defend like 70 here if we're trying to defend around 70%, but I think that's going to be pretty hard to do here. Okay, so as is usually going to be the case, we're probably not going to donk bet anything. Our calling range is for the most part a condensed range preflop, so we're not usually going to have a donk betting range because it just doesn't usually make sense. So we're going to start with betting nothing, and then our total checking range will be our entire range, which is 105 combos. Okay, so let's do the check raising range first and see if there's anything that looks like a kind of obvious check raise. I would argue, even though this is something we of course can't prove, that we're going to want to check raise aces. And the reason for that is giving a free card with aces is really, really risky, obviously, because our opponent can outdraw us, but not only can he outdraw us, we can just lose value. For all we know, he 3-bet his preflop with queens or kings, and then we want to get that check raise in now so we're pretty much certain we can stack him. But if we check call with aces, the turn can come an 8 or a 9 or an ace, and we lose our value from these other overpairs. So let's start with check raising the aces. I would think 9s you can check call, but again, it's one of those kind of type of things because I really don't like giving free cards, but I want to check call some strong hands to protect my range. So I think we're going to check call 9s. Oh, all right. And so total accomplished check is 105. Let's see. So let's start with check calling 9s. I think we're going to want to check call those. I think we're going to check call 8s. I can see an argument for check, let's start off with maybe the more obvious stuff. So ace-9 suited, I think check call. Jack-9 suited, I think check call. 10-9 suited, I think check call. 8s you can kind of go either way because 8s actually retain their equity really well against better hands. So 8s might actually be a check raise. So I'm kind of looking real quickly now to see how many sort of pairs we have that we can check call with. Oh, we can also check call 10s. Okay. So again, not provable, but I think we're going to want to check raise 8s. And the reason for that is eights actually have pretty robust equity. So let's get rid of these ranges real quick in Poker Stove, and let's just see like how much equity eights have against pocket aces. So eights versus pocket aces, clear aces, boom. So eights have almost 40% equity against pocket aces, and I really don't like playing eights out of position, so I think I would check raise it here. And it's a good example of a pretty complex thing where it's like check raising eights works well, because if we make our opponent fold overcards are pretty likely to outdraw us. So if our opponent's, c-betting here with, let's say, an ace-queen suited or an ace-king or some random ace-10 and he, bet folds, that's awesome. Ace-10 especially had a lot of equity against us. Actually, I guess his 10's tainted, so not as much as I thought. But like ace-jack, any of those hands, any hand with two overcards is going to have a good amount of equity against eights, is what I'm getting at. And eights also retain their equity really well against hands that beat us. And there's always a chance that our opponent was like 3-betting preflop with a hand like 7-8 or 6-8 or something like that, and we get it in and we're the favorite. So I think I would check raise eights, even though it's not really a value bet or a bluff. It's kind of like, a hand that just doesn't want to give free cards that retains its equity pretty well. So I think check raising eights is fine here, although I'm definitely not really looking at it as a value bet or a bluff. Okay, and then we're keeping this check calling range relatively tight if we're putting eights in the check raising range. Again, this seems reasonable here because this is not a board texture that I like playing out of position. So I would rather emphasize check raising rather than check calling, just by the nature of the board texture, which is being out of position sucks here. Obviously, I'd want to emphasize check calling a little bit more if we had a board texture like this, which is just much easier to, check call a bunch of hands that aren't afraid of giving free cards. So again, let's get the right suits for the nits. 9 of spades, 7 of hearts, 6 of clubs. And likewise, I think 9-8 suited can be check raised too. So again, this is one of those things where I'm kind of talking myself into liking check raising 8s and 9-8 suited more, especially when I just saw how much equity they have. I'm actually curious. Let's just see 9-8 suited. How much equity do you have? Yeah, that's just crazy equity. So we should just, I think, check raise it to ruin our opponent's positional advantage. Okay, so we're check raising. This is our value. Not value, well, the aces are at least value, but 8s, 9-8 suited, so maybe we want, let's say, 10 or 12 bluffs here. That's just a guess. We don't want to be bluffing nearly as aggressively as we would if we had a more stack depth, especially since our value hand's pretty vulnerable here. And then, as I already mentioned, these hands aren't really value hands or bluffs. So we can bluff some hands, which we'll get to in a minute, but let's keep working on our check calling range. Okay, so I think we can check call with like ace-queen suited, the one with the backdoor flush draws. Let's see what else we got. So we're going to have a good amount of like gut shot type stuff. So let's just see. So we have made hands. We have 12, 18 made hands. So we can add a good amount more of. Let's see what else we can add. We don't have any open and straight draws or anything, do we? Or other than the 8s, no. So gut shots. Okay. So I would say we can check call with that. We could probably check call with... King 10 suited is probably also okay to check call with. It's not ideal, and it can be check raise bluffed as well. Let's check raise bluff like Jack 10 suited, and let's check raise. We can even do all 4 of those. Let's check raise bluff Queen 10 suited. So these hands, obviously, the Queen 10 suited and the Jack 10 suited, they just have the gut shot. And there's always that chance that we check raise bluff, with Queen 10 suited, our opponent calls with pocket jacks, and then we just turn a queen. So I'm trying to utilize the gut shot here by check raising it. And the great thing about check raising Jack 10 suited and Queen 10 suited is, even though they're not ideal check raises, these are hands that when we check raise Queen 10 suited, will probably make our opponent fold his like ace queen, or if he could have a hand like, sometimes he might have a hand like Queen King or Queen Jack, we can make him fold those type hands. So when check raising Queen 10 suited, we can make him fold some hands that dominate us. All right. I'm really not liking the idea of check calling with a hand like King Queen. It could be theoretically correct, I'm not sure, but I just don't like the idea of check calling with King Queen when even like the King and the Queen are going to be pretty tainted. Obviously we can turn a Queen, lose to Ace Queen, pocket Kings, pocket Aces, in addition to all of his bluffs having a ton of, a lot of the hands our opponent would have bluffed with preflop. Like we had this range, where was it? Right here, a lot of this stuff can like pick up gut shots and stuff, like 8, 6, 7, 5 suited, 6, 4 suited. Those hands all have a lot of equity. So I probably would avoid check calling with hands like King Queen. Even a hand like Ace Queen, again, it's going to be tainted decently often, so I'm not in love with check calling that. So I'm trying to find a few more hands that work well as check calls, but I'm just not really seeing them. So Yeah, it's tough, and this is just kind of showcasing the fact that I don't think we can defend enough hands here. So I'm going to tally up how many hand combos we have, and we'll kind of go from there. So I tallied them up and then added in another King 10 suited combo. We don't necessarily need the backdoor flush draw, and I'm also going to add an Ace 10 suited for another couple of gut shots. So that gets us to 28. And this is 51 combos, so we're only defending about half of our checks. So we need to either find more hands we can defend by check calling, or kind of acknowledge that our opponent's going to bet this flop incredibly aggressively because he doesn't want to give us free cards, and his range seems to be doing pretty well against ours. So let's look at his range once more again. Like, just everything in this range, other than, like, Ace-X suited, and I guess some of this King-Queen off and Queen-Jack off stuff, is really just doing pretty well here. Again, this board really hits these bluffs pretty well. It hits these bluffs pretty well. And then he has all these really premium hands. So yeah, this is, I think, a very, very good flop for the 3-better. Not only because position's advantageous, but just because 9 high flops hit his range better as well. So I'm not sure I would defend more aggressively than this. Like, I'm trying to force myself to defend more aggressively. But on this board, I think we just got a bad flop where being out of position sucks. And I'm not sure we want to get more aggro than we are right here. So I think something like this looks reasonable. And I get how our opponent can defend I get how our opponent can very profitably c-bet any 2 cards here. That doesn't mean it's more profitable for him to c-bet than check. But we're already checking raising here pretty aggressively, and I just don't see that many more hands that we can defend, because every hand we would check call with sort of a pretty tainted hand, and then we're already check raising with a good amount of bluffs. So I think something like this seems reasonable, and I think we just got a bad flop. Also, keep in mind that even if our opponent can profitably bluff the flop with any 2 cards, he still had to pay a good amount of money to get that bluff opportunity because we called his 3-bet pre-flop. So hopefully people watching this video, since it's going to be a pretty difficult one, already understand that. But it often will make sense in theory for our opponent to be able to make a profitable bluff with any 2 cards after he's already taken a risk. And that's happened here because he has risk money pre-flop to get this bluff opportunity. Okay, so I'm not going to be defending this checks that much here. I'm going to use my calculator that's right in front of me. 51 divided by 105. We're only defending 48.6% of our checks here. So this just looks like a very hard board to defend. All right, let's generate another one. Okay, so this one's going to be way easier. Flop, king of spades, 10 of spades, 10 of clubs. Plug it into this right here. King of spades, 10 of spades, 10 of clubs. One thing I want to point out is usually when the board has 2 high cards, it tends to hit the cold calling range pretty well. So you can already see here our 3-bet cold calling range just makes a ton of pairs and gut shots. There's almost like no bad hands we have here, I guess, other than like 9s and 8s. And I guess ace-9 suited. So let's see the equity. Oops, that's not what I wanted to do. So I'm just going to pause it and then cut and paste that in. Okay, so this time our range has 55% equity. So a pretty big jump in equity. And on top of that, we might have more premium hands than the opponent. So I'm going to look right now. The 3-bet cold calling range has 3 of a kind 12%. The button 3-betting range has 3 of a kind 3%. Yeah, so it actually looks like our range is quite a bit better than our opponent's here. So this is just the exact opposite of the last board texture. Here we got lucky to get this kind of flop texture. So I'm not expecting to donk bet very often in 3-bet pots because the 3-better's range will usually be polarized relative to our 3-bet calling range. But here, that doesn't look like it's the case because we have more 10s in our range than our opponent has in his range. And again, this is the 3-betting range right here. It's hard to say this is exactly always going to be true. Somewhat people might 3-bet bluff with like ace-10 off or king-10 off pre-flop. It's always hard to say. But for these ranges that we have right here, and just in general, our range looks like it's doing quite well here. So here, it looks like we're going to be able to have some sort of donk betting range, because if we never donk bet on this board, our opponent's just not going to see bet enough. I really like visualizing donk betting in that kind of way, which is just imagine if you never donk bet here, the checking range gets so strong that the opponent just decides to back off because we have, pocket aces, we have so many good pairs of kings, and we have so many 10s that if we check all of our strong hands here, he's just going to check back at a super high frequency. So we're better off betting with some hands rather than just, checking everything. Okay, so total combos is 92. So we have way less combos just because we made so many pairs and trips and stuff. All right, and let's start with the value betting range. So let's think what kind of hands we want to donk bet with here. So I think we can donk bet with this is often going to be the trend in 3-bet pots, which is you don't want to do everything with the same type of hand. It's like that in raise pots too, but it's especially important in 3-bet pots to realize, like, ace queen off, for example, makes 16 combos here. Sorry, ace queen and ace queen off make 16 combos here. And 16 divided by 92, again, I have my calculator, is 17% of our range. So 17% of our range is ace queen here, which isn't that rare for something like that in 3-bet pots, which is why it's important to realize you're probably going to take multiple line with the same hands a lot. So, for example, here we might check call some ace queen, check raise some, and bet some. So let's just keep that in mind. But I would say, for the most part, we can value bet with a hand like, let's see how often does our opponent have us beat. It was like almost never, right? Let's see how often. I want to see how often aces have us beat. Or, sorry, how often we have, like, aces beat. Yeah, pretty much, like, never. All right, so let's say we want to, I think we're going to value bet with hands like aces. So let's say aces is 6. I mean, we can get into a lot of detail with the removal effect, but I think that's a little out of scope for right now. You know what? I lied. I think we're going to check aces because if we go bet, 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 a lot of what we're going to beat is our opponent's, ace-king hands and pocket aces hands. That's what he's going to have to call down with a lot. So that's obviously got a bad removal effect for aces. So let's not bet aces, and instead let's value bet. Let's value bet some like tens and such. Value betting range. Let's say we're going to bet. I mean, it has a removal effect, but it's not as big a deal. So let's say ace 10 suited, queen 10 suited, jack 10 suited. Let's at least bet those. And then, like, tens and king 10 suited and stuff is trickier because with a hand like tens and king 10 suited, I kind of want my opponent to hit his, like, tainted draw. So I think we can bet these hands on the flop because I don't think our opponent's going to fold most of his gut shots and straight draws. So I think it's still okay to bet the pocket tens, which is only one hand combo, and the king 10 suited, which is 2 hand combos, because, again, I think we're still going to get that chance of making our opponent hit his gut shot. He'll still call with his gut shot on the flop, and he might hit it on the turn. But with tens and king 10 suited, we might not want to double barrel the turn, because that way it gives our opponent a chance to bluff, and we're just straight up nutted. So this looks like a reasonable start for the value betting range, and then I'm trying to think of what we want to do with exactly. See, this is the problem in 3-bet pots is we're going to do a lot of different stuff with the same type of hand. So let's see. How many top pairs do we have? We have 16% top pairs. How many does the button have? Okay, he has a lot more top pair. Okay, so I still don't think we're going to be donk betting like crazy here because even though we have more equity than our opponent, we have a lot of hands that want like 2 streets for value. So that would be a hand like king, queen, or king, jack probably want 2 streets for value, and I don't think they need to bet on the flop. It'd be fine to bet some on the flop to check call the turn. So let's actually even do that. So I'm just going to put king, queen, 8. And that's me just saying we're going to bet some of our king, queen on the flop, but we're going to check call them on the turn sometimes, or we're going to bet flop and turn with king, queen, and we're going to check call them on the river sometimes. So we're going to take different lines with the same hand because king, queen makes up like, a 1/7 of our range here. It just makes up so many combos. So let's say that's our value betting range. And we're just, it's a rough draft right now. We're trying to make sure our checking range isn't too strong. So this is going to give us 17 combos of value bets. Quite a few. And so in order to balance out that many value bets, we can probably bluff like 1.5 times as many combos, give or take. So let's say here we want to bluff, I don't know, maybe like just under 30 combos, like 28 or 29, because our value bets are very strong here, and our bluffs will have a lot of equity. And we didn't even get into account draws. So let's say we want around 30 bluffs, give or take. And then let's see, how many draws do we have? Flush draws, 6. So let's just say we're going to bet flush draws 4. And then we'll say we check a call with 2 flush draws. I don't really care to go into detail about which ones go where. Okay, so we're betting that, and then we need to have like 30 bluffs. So let's just look at what I want to, obviously what I want in a bluff is I want to bluff with hands that can make my opponent fold a hand that might dominate me on the turn. So, for example, if I knew my opponent would fold ace-queen to a flop bet, which I don't think he will, but if I knew my opponent would fold ace-queen to a flop bet, we would want to bluff with a hand like jack-9 suited if we make the opponent fold ace-jack, because ace-jack and jack-9 suited both make a straight on the queen turn. But obviously, if we have Jack 9 suited and our opponent has Ace Jack and the turn card comes a queen, which happens about 1/10 of the time, that's not that rare for the turn to come a queen in that situation, we're overstraighted, so we get stacked. So Jack 9 suited would make like the perfect bluff if we made our opponent fold Ace Jack, because that way we make him fold a hand that can dominate us for our whole stack on the turn. So I think it's going to be hard to find a lot of hands that do that here, since I don't think our opponent's going to fold many gut shots. So with what we bluff with here, it's probably not going to be all that tremendously important. And it's especially difficult because we don't know exactly what his 3-betting range is. He might not 3-bet Ace Jack button versus cutoff. I know I don't. And then we don't know exactly how frequently he's 3-betting with Ace Queen preflop. Okay, so I added in Queen Jack suited for a draw to bet with, and I also added in some bluffs. So I'm bluffing the 15 Ace Jack combos, so that's all the Ace Jack except for the flush draw. And then I'm also adding in 9-8 of clubs, which is 3 to a flush, 3 to a straight. Jack 9 suited. Hopefully our opponent doesn't have many Ace Jack in his range anyways, or if he does, hopefully he won't call with them and the turn won't be a queen. And then I also am bluffing with some of the Ace Queen. The other thing I wanted to talk about is the 9s and 8s are pretty interesting here. Because I think 9s and 8s can actually win at showdown 2 ways. Or several ways, actually. The first is if we check call 9s or 8s on the flop, it's not that hard for our opponent to have bluffed on the flop with a hand like Ace Queen, or just even a weaker hand. It doesn't even need to have a gut shot. We check call with, pocket 9s. Our opponent gives up on his bluff, or if he has a hand like Ace Queen, he tries to win with his Ace Queen high. So that's one way that we can win with 9s. We also can bet 9s on the flop, and if our opponent calls with Ace Queen, he might hope we're bluffing, and then he just checks down trying to win with Ace Queen high after we've, bet the flop and he's called. So 9s can win both by betting the flop or by, checking. So it's a little bit difficult to know exactly what to do with a hand like 9s or 8s here. The hand could even make sense as a bet on the flop, and then we check fold them on the turn. So a little tough to know exactly what to do with those hands here. 9s might even be a okay bet, especially if our opponent will call. Well, the problem is our opponent doesn't really have any underpairs that are lower than 9s, so that's not really going to happen. So yeah, 9s and 8s could probably work as both a bet or as a check call here. I'm going to start with assuming we're going to check call the 9s. So let's put that right here. And I realize how often 9s will check call and be outdrawn. Our opponent's overcards will have a lot of equity, but it still can work. And usually if he has, as I've already mentioned several times, if he has a hand with 2 overcards and a gut shot, he's not usually going to fold it to a bet anyways. All right, so total combos bet's going to be 26 plus 7, which is 33, 33 plus 17, which is 50. So we're betting 50 hand combos, and we're checking 42. So if we want to defend about 2/3 of our checks, we're going to have to defend, let's just do 70%, 42 times 0.7. We're going to want to defend about 29 of our checks. So our goal will be to defend, let's say, 29 checks total. So we already had aces. So aces can be check raised or check called. So let's say we're going to check raise 3. We're going to check call 3. Our check calling range might get too weak if we check raise that many. So let's say we do something like this. Okay, so that gets us to 18 combos that we've check raised, and then we're going to have way too many. We're going to have way too many hands for check calling with. So let's see if we're check calling with, how many king queen did we have? We had king queen is going to be 4. Right, because we bet 8. And then we had king jack suited, which is going to be 3. And then if we have, so that's 15, that's 19. All right, so I just paused it and played around with it for a little bit. And this is what I came up with. So I decided to check raise 4 of the aces and check call 2. And the reason why I'm check raising 4 of the aces is, remember, we don't want to give our opponent tons of free draws with his ace jack, or he probably doesn't have ace jack, with his ace queen, his, anything he was 3-bet bluffing with pre-flop, like queen 9 suited, jack 9 suited, those hands all have gut shots. We don't want to just hand out free cards here. He can always run a runner flush and stuff like that. So check raising aces is kind of useful for that, especially since aces are beat so rarely. And we also can check raise some ace queen and a flush draw to sort of balance that range. And then we're going to check call with some ace queen. So this is, like a vulnerable hand we're check calling with, and we can bluff with this hand later if we want, if the turn checks through. Then we're check calling with our medium strength stuff like some king queen and some king jack suited. That's pretty obvious. We're check calling with some aces, check calling with one flush draw, and then the more vulnerable pocket nines. If we do this, we defend 28 checks, which is right around what we originally wanted to defend. So we're defending 28 divided by 42, or 67% of our checking range. So at a glance, like this looks like a reasonably balanced range. We're still betting this flop over half the time. I'm going to put the exact flop betting frequency in here. 50 divided by 92 is, we're betting the flop 54.4% of the time. And then we're defending 66.7% of our checks. So this looks like we have about the right amount of our flop. We're betting at around the right frequency, and we're defending our checks at around the right frequency. And we could tweak this stuff a little bit. There's obviously going to be a few ways we can improve it, but at a rough glance, this looks pretty good. So if we see a board texture like this, we just want to know that, hey, 2 high cards tends to favor our range, and also the fact that it's a paired 10 tends to favor our range. So this is a good board to donk bet, even though that's going to be something we rarely do in a 3-bet pot. Okay. I also wanted to point out with regards to check raising aces, I do think we want to check raise some hands here because we don't want to let our opponent know we can bet the flop and he'll never get check raised. That lets him realize his equity too effectively. But aces still have that kind of bad removal effect, but they're going to have that removal effect whether or not we check call or check raise. So we've already checked to our opponent and given him the chance to bluff. So then it really becomes one of those questions, which is like, if our opponent has queen 9, would we have rather check called or check raised? Because if we check call, he can obviously outdraw us, but he also might keep bluffing and lose more money. Whereas if we check raise, he's probably going to fold, so he can't outdraw us, but we won't win additional money. And that's one of those very detailed things to do with the removal effect. And it might even be as simple as check call aces without the spade. Sorry, check call aces with the spade and check raise aces without the spade. Because if we have, let's say we have aces with a spade, obviously if we have ace with a spade, we really want our opponent to runner a flush if he has queen jack off with the queen of spades, or if he has ace queen off with the queen of spades. So when you are getting into that sort of detailed removal effect, just really think like, okay, if I check call here, do I give my opponent a chance to just draw into a hand that I dominate? So a very detailed removal effect, but people have been asking me about that stuff a little bit more. And if you're really deciding like, how do I balance my bluffing range? How do I balance my check calling range, and things look close, then little things like that might matter a lot. So I'm pretty into, trying to let my opponent get a bad turn card with a hand that he has dominated. So here, I guess I would probably check call with aces with a spade and check raise with aces without the spade. So now that we've seen a board that misses our range and one that hits our range, let's generate another one. Oh, that didn't change much at all. So that's the cool thing about doing boards is we kind of already know sort of how to approach this one. Let's just see how much the equity changes when we don't have 2 10s. But we're not going to redo this board because it's going to be too similar to the last one. And we do get that decrease in equity since we have less, we have less trips and there are more 10s in our range than our opponents. But let's generate another one. Really? All right, so let's do this one. Let's do the, this one will be actually quite a bit different because there aren't 2 high cards. And the second high card really helps our range a lot. So I don't know exactly, but I wouldn't be surprised if the cold calling range only has like 47 or 48% equity here. Like not having that 10 really hurts the range. The 10 is very useful for the cold calling range. All right, so let's see. Oh, wow, even more than that. So I was already expecting it to have a big fall in equity, but that's huge. So just let's do that once more. Notice how much more equity we have when there's a 10 rather than a 3. 10 gives us 53.8. 3 gives us 44. So 10% less equity when there's a 3 rather than a 10. Big deal. Really big deal. Okay, so total combos is going to be 106. And I don't think this is going to be a board where we're going to be able to defend 2/3 of our checking range, but we might be. No, we probably can't, but we'll look. And then we're not going to bet anything here because our range is just a lot weaker than the opponent's. He has the ace-king in his range. We don't have really many strong hands, and our range has less equity. And we're out of position, so we're definitely checking all 106 combos here. No donk betting range. So I don't think we're going to want to have a check-raising range here because the only hand that's strong enough to check-raise is aces, and those hands just don't fear giving a free card, so we'd probably rather call, let our opponent keep bluffing, especially since he's going to be, pretty likely to be bluffing on this flop. And then we can also check call with all of our kings, obviously. We have a good amount of those combos. And then we're check calling with all the, pocket pairs that are below kings. So this gets us right here to, let's count 18, 21, 24 to 42 combos. And one thing I just want to point out, which is often a useful little exercise to do, is imagine we want to call 2/3 of the time on the flop and 2/3 of the time on the turn. So that would mean it'd be 106. That's how many hands we have on the flop times 0.667. That gets us 71 combos times 0.667. So that gets us 47 combos. So if we were to call on the, flop and turn 2/3 of the time, we'd have to defend 47 hand combos. Whereas this range right here is already 42 hand combos. So obviously we don't know what the turn card's going to be. But for the most part, this looks like the range that we'll call twice. And if we have to call, 3 bets, we're probably going to mostly end up defending our aces, kings, and then maybe we'll also have to maybe call with tens, and then it depends on what the turn of the river are. We might make a better pair by then. So just know that even though we only have 42 pairs on the flop, if our opponent fires 2 barrels, we're mostly going to defend with this range. If he fires 1 barrel, we'll defend with this range, as well as some ace-queen, which I'll put in right now. It's going to be ace-queen 16. I think we'll call with all those here. And then if he bets 3 streets, we're not even going to call with most of these middle pairs. Okay, so ace-queen is 16, and then we can just, these boards are really easy to do. So let's add in some other stuff. So let's add in the 3 ace-jack suited. Let's say we want to add in the 3 queen-jack suited, because the queen-jack suited are going to turn straight draws whenever we turn a 10. They can also turn pairs with the queen or the jack, or turn the flush draw. So I like queen-jack suited here. So let's count how many hands that is. So that's 64 hand combos. So let's also add in, I think, ace 10 suited and ace 9 suited to get us to, come on. Oh my gosh, this, it's embarrassing. To get us to 72 combos. So 72 divided by 106, that's going to be right around 70%, a little bit less than that. All right, so we're defending 68% of the time here. That seems reasonable. And of course, some of these hands are going to have to be bluffed if we check call the flop and our opponent checks back the turn. Maybe ace-jack suited won't have to. It will depend on the turn and the river card. But at least the queen-jack suited and probably the ace-9 suited will need to be bluffed. Okay, so yeah, this I mean, it was easy because it's just a super dry board and we're only defending by check calling. But this looks like around what I would defend on this flop. And then just remember, even though this range looks very, very weak here, you're not going to have to end up going to showdown with these types of hands if your opponent bets 2 or 3 times. I know that's super obvious, but like really look at the magnitude, which is if your opponent bets the turn in the river, we're going to be folding a whole bunch of hands, so our range gets stronger much more quickly. And also, if we can start raising with aces on, like, let's say we decide to check raise all in sometimes on the turn. So, for example, let's say the turn's like a jack of spades and we want to, check raise all in sometimes. We're also going to get a check raise with some like turned, so with some with our pocket aces, as well as some, let's say, 2 pairs, as well as some sort of flush draws we might want to bluff with. So if the turn did come a jack of spades, maybe we check raise with, pocket aces, king jack, and some turn flush draws. So just be aware, we're going to improve on the turn a lot, and we're not going to end up having a showdown in most of these hands. Okay, so that one was easy. And one last thing to point out is even though we did defend 2/3 of our range on this flop, we have no way of knowing if we actually are defending the optimal range here. So maybe we defended, maybe our opponent should be able to profitably bet with any 2 cards on the flop, make an immediate profit, and it just happens that ace-9 suited is too weak to call or something like that. There's no way we can know that for sure, but this seems reasonable-ish enough. If I was going to do anything with this range, I'd probably get rid of the ace-9 suited and then maybe the queen-jack suited or the ace-10 suited. Okay, so let's just generate another one. No whammy, no whammy, stop. Oh, so this one's going to be terrible. Super, super bad. So this one's about as bad of a flop as we can possibly get. So this one's not going to probably have much analysis, but we'll look at it just in case. So 6 of spades, 5 of clubs, 4 diamonds. Before I even look at the equity here, and I imagine we're doing quite bad in terms of equity, just realize we have no strong hands other than pocket aces. We have like the most vulnerable range ever, and we don't even have any draws. I guess 8s or 9/8 suited can turn the gutter, but that's it. So this is a board texture that's just incredibly rare to have a 6-high flop, and this is just the worst one possible because there's 3 cards that are in ascending order, 4, 5, 6. Just absolutely terrible flop. Okay, so we have 42% equity. Here, this is just a great example of a flop where there's absolutely no amount of combos I'm trying to defend. So total combo is going to be 112. I would defend by check raising here really aggressively. Making a check calling range itself is going to suck. There's not good options here. Like even a hand, like let's take pocket nines. Pocket nines is probably one of the best hands in our range, but pocket nines is extremely vulnerable to being outdrawn here. I want to see how much equity pocket nines has even against our opponent's range. Yeah, like even pocket nines only have 55% equity, and we're out of position here. So obviously I have no idea how you're exactly supposed to make your range work here in theory, but you're going to end up folding way, way too much here. On this flop, I would check raise really aggressively with all of our good hands for the most part, which is mainly just aces. Add in a couple bluffs and try to avoid check calling if possible. You're just not going to be able to check call effectively here. So if you can, emphasize check raising. If your opponent makes really, really small bets in position, then you're going to have to develop a check calling range. But for the most part, try to stay away from check calling here and just know there's really not going to be anything you can do here where you're going to like the way your range looks. So here I would probably some combination of check raise, check call with pretty much like aces, tens, nines, eights. And that's about it. And then like obviously you could add in maybe some ace queen suited or 9-8 suited for like a few bluffs, even though these aren't really value bets when you check raise or check call with tens, nines, or eights. So for the most part, you're just defending a super small fraction of your range here because, you know, as I said, like the best hand in our range besides nines is tens, and it has 56% equity, which is terrible when you're out of position on a board this coordinated. So mostly just check fold here. Okay, let's randomly generate another one. Okay. So I don't imagine this one's going to be all too different from the last board we did, which was King 3-2 Rainbow. Obviously, there's a flush draw, but for the most part, it's not that different. So let's just write it down. So total combo is going to be 106. We should be able to do this one really quickly. We're not going to bet anything here. Our range is nowhere near strong enough to bet. Total combo is bet 0. Total combo is checked 106. All right, and let's just start check calling stuff. I still don't think you're going to want to check raise anything on this flop. If you were going to check raise anything, it would be aces without a spade, but I don't really like that. So check raising range is going to be 0. Check calling range, aces. I'm just going to put it all in real quick after pausing it. So I added it in. We're calling with the middle pairs, the flush draw. This ace queen 7 is any ace with a spade or two hearts. Ace jack with the ace of spades, ace jack with the ace and the jack of hearts. So for the backdoor flush draw, that gets us 64 combos, which is just under 2/3 of combos. You know, you could check call with a few ace queen without a spade. You could check call with the ace jack off with the jack of spades. But for the most part, this seems reasonable. I guess I'd also like check calling with, like, let's just say the ace 10 of hearts because they're a little bit extra tricky. But for the most part, something like this seems good. I wouldn't. We do have less equity than our opponent on this board texture, and we're out of position. So I'll put the range in real quick again. But yeah, there's no reason why we need to defend exactly 70% of the time. We only have, oops, that's not the right board. We only have probably, around 43 or 44% equity, if I remember from last time. Maybe a little bit. Okay, sure. So we only have 41% equity here, or 40% equity here. So this range actually is pretty reasonably playable, though. Like, this is a board texture where position is not all that valuable. So even though we have less equity than I was expecting here, like, this isn't a board that I'm miserable on. Whereas on the last board, our range had more equity, but I just want to make sure this is right. But this board position is not nearly as valuable. We have a lot more hands that can check call comfortably. So here, I think we're able to defend just under 2/3 of our combos. All these hands seem profitable to me. If you disagree and you think you should fold ace 10 of hearts, no big deal. So here, I'll just do the math on my calculator real quick. 65 divided by 106, we're defending about 61% of the time. So give or take, that looks good. All right, let's just keep going. Let's generate another one. All right, so we know the drill now. Like, this is a board that's bad for our range. We're not going to defend enough to prevent our opponent from profitably betting any two cards. And I have worked out the math for this. The odds of a board coming a certain high card I have in the book that's coming out for 2+2. And I think off the top of my head, an 8 high or lower board is like 1 in 8. So we've just coincidentally happened to see a few really bad board textures for our range. So on a board like this, I think you want to defend a really, really aggressive check raising range if the opponent makes reasonable size C bets in position. Whereas if he bets small, then I would develop the check calling range. So this is not a board we can really analyze all that well. Just know we're going to be check folding here a ton. And in general, if the board comes 9 high or lower, you're going to be check folding a lot, but especially the 8 high or lower, you're going to be check folding a bunch. Because even the 9 high, we make quite a few more pairs. All right, so let's just keep going. All right, so this is a good one to analyze. Looking forward to doing this one. So 10 of spades, 8 of hearts, 3 of diamonds. Okay, so we have 100 combos. So the fact that we have 100 combos will make them half especially easy. And let's put in the board and evaluate. Okay, so here we have 56% equity. So I'm noticing just with the range that I'm defending, the 10 high board actually seems surprisingly good for our range. So now, since I've noticed that, I want to see like, okay, well, let's compare jack high. Evaluate. So jack high is a lot worse for our range. Let's compare queen high. Queen high is also good for our range. I already knew that. King high is bad for our range. I knew that. Ace high should be somewhere in the middle, I'm guessing, and it is. Okay, so the 10 high board and the queen high board seem to be especially good for this cold calling range. Makes sense since we have stuff like pocket tens and a lot of suited jacks. Okay, so let's just jump in. So our range has 52% equity. Positions. Okay, so our range has a little bit more equity than our opponents, but since we're out of position and position is still reasonably valuable on this board texture, I don't think we're going to have a donk betting range. And if I had to guess, in theory, we would probably have a really, really small donk betting range. So I just contradicted myself a little bit. So let me just be very clear. All the time, in theory, I think we should have like a donk betting range, but if we should only be donk betting 10% of the time, I just say don't donk bet. Likewise, some other times I might think we should be, donk betting at a very high frequency, but if we should only be donk betting like 10% of the pot, I say just don't donk bet. Because even if I think right here, if we check all of our hands, our checking range might be just barely too strong. It's so close, and it's so difficult to develop this really, really, really small donk betting range for that much change in EV that I would just say it's probably not worth it. Let's figure out how we defend on this board if we only checked. And then if it seems like we're checking, too strong of a range, maybe we should worry about donk betting like 15 out of 100 combos. But for the most part here, even if in theory we should be donk betting super, super rarely, we're human. We're not going to worry about that. We're going to try to defend, our checking range here if we check all of our hands. Okay, so value betting range is going to be 0, 0, and 0. All right, so total combos bet is going to be 0. Total combos check is going to be 100. All right, so check calling range, check raising range. So let's check raise some stuff here. Like, I think we can check raise a hand like aces. Aces are a little bit more vulnerable to being outdrawn than hands like 8s or 10s. Trying to think if aces have a bad removal effect here. Okay, after having thought about it, I do dislike the fact that when we check raise aces, we make our opponent, sometimes fold a hand like ace king or ace queen if he did bet them on the flop. I don't even think necessarily in theory he should bet fold ace king, but I think a lot of people will do it. But if we have aces ourselves, our opponent's less likely to have ace king, and I don't want to just give him tons and tons of free, I don't want him to always be able to bet the flop and be able to, that he's pretty much guaranteed to see the turn card. So I do like check raising the aces, so let's put those down in the check raising range. Also, as I've mentioned earlier, it's just nice when we check raise aces and we make sure we stack our opponent when he has king, queens, or jacks. Okay, so let's do the check calls then first. So we have 10s, which is going to be 3 combos. I think we can check call 9s here, which is going to be 6 combos, 8s, which is going to be 3 combos. And then we have all these ace 10 suited, king 10 suited, queen 10 suited, jack 10 suited, which is going to be 12 combos total. Okay. And then we're going to also want to check call with our ace queen hands, which is going to be 16 combos. Ace queen just always makes up so many freaking combos. And then queen jack suited will be another 4 combos. They have the gut shot. Okay. So I'm going to pause for a minute. So we're defending 44 combos by check calling, and we're defending 6 so far by check raising. So obviously we're going to need bluffs here to balance out this range, which we'll get to in a minute. Let's see what else we have. Jack 9 suited. Oh, that's going to be a good one. So Jack 9 suited, likewise gut shots as well. How many gut shots do we have? All right, so we just have 4. A hand like Jack 9 suited could really be check called or check raised. I'm going to prefer to just check call with it, but check raising with it would be fine as well. The hand retains its equity and is very, very robust. But at the end of the day, I tend to dislike check raising with a hand like Jack 9 on this flop here more in practice than I would in theory, because people are going to probably 3-bet all in on this flop more often than they should. So if I were in position and I bet this flop and my opponent check raised me from the cutoff, I probably would never 3-bet. But sometimes people are going to 3-bet. So I hate it. It sucks to check raise Jack 9 suited and have our opponent go all in. So because of that, let's just call with Jack 9 suited. We can check raise it all in on the turn if we want, to balance that out with some sets for 2 pairs and stuff like that. Okay, so we don't really have any good hands to... Oh, we have 9-8 suited. I just noticed you. So a hand like 9-8 suited could be check raise bluffed. That would be fine. I actually think I'm going to do that. I like using sort of at least some high equity hands. And 9-8 suited retains the equity very well as a check raise bluff. So that can do that. And then we could also have check raise bluff with, any hand that don't really want to check call. So if we don't want to check call with, let's say, ace jack suited, and we don't want to check call with, let's say, king jack suited, those hands might work pretty well as bluffs because those hands can just turn flush draws in both cases, an open and straight draw too. So that gets us to 15 combos, which is maybe a little bit too much on the bluffing side, but it's pretty reasonable. It's pretty close. So this is 48 combos up here right now. So we have 48 here, 15 down here for 63 total. Let's see if there's any more hands we can add by check calling. We already have all the ace queen. Okay. So, you know what we can do? Let's do this. Let's check raise the ace 9 suited because that's 3 to a flush and 3 to a straight. And let's check call the ace jack suited. So that just gives us a few more hand combos we can defend with. And the cool thing about check calling with ace jack suited is our opponent might have c-bet bluffed the flop with a hand like queen jack or with a hand like ace x suited, and ace jack's more likely to dominate our opponent if he turned a pair. Obviously, we can be dominated ourselves when we turn a pair with ace jack, but ace jack's a little bit more likely to dominate or split with the opponent than ace 9 is. So that's why I like check calling with ace jack, and then I also like the 3 to a flush, 3 to a straight properties of ace 9 suited. Obviously the nut flush and straights are very robust, so I would prefer to check raise with those. Okay, so, I also just realized now I missed 10-9 suited. Some people are probably yelling at their screens, so that gets us to 54. All right, so now we're defending 69 combos out of 100, which is about 70%. And we could defend more if we think there's more profitable hands to defend with, but this looks really good. So total hands defend, 69. Check defending frequency, 69%. All right. So I think I have time to do one more really quickly, or at least talk about it. We maybe can't write everything down. Okay, so that's an interesting one. So let's put this in here. We're probably not going to be able to write out all the combos, but let's see. All right, so we have a little bit more equity than our opponent here. That doesn't surprise me since we have so many high cards. The reason why we don't crush our opponent equity-wise is probably because I had him 3-bet bluffing king jack off, which makes a ton of really strong hands. So here we probably wouldn't want to donk bet because our opponent has 2 pair or better 22% of the time, whereas we only have, how often do we have it? Oh, we have it 28% of the time. That's a lot. But we don't have nearly as many straights. Yeah, so here we probably wouldn't want to donk bet because our opponent just has so many super, super strong hands in his range, but I don't think we're going to have problems defending our checks here. So flop is going to be ace of spades, queen of clubs, 10 of diamonds, total combos 92. Again, we maybe have some really small donk betting, a really low donk betting frequency in theory, but I think we probably aren't going to want to donk bet here because our opponent just has so many more premium hands than us. And by premium, I pretty much just mean the straight here. Like the straight's like the most amazing hand here, and so is sets. How many times do we have sets? We have sets 12%. That's actually a good amount. Yeah, so probably still not a donk betting range here, but it's very close. Total combos checked, so that was 92. I don't need to write all. Well, yeah, let's write it out. Okay, so check calling range. All right, so check raising range, check calling range. I don't think we're going to want to slow play much here. So let's see. I would check raise. Probably going to check raise pocket tens and pocket aces. I get how aces have a bad removal effect, so it could be wrong to check raise with aces, but I don't want to give a ton of free cards, and at the end of the day, I don't know how much value we're going to really get from our opponent when we have aces and he doesn't have a pretty good hand. Our opponent could still have pocket queens, he could still have ace queen. Obviously, if he has king jack, we're behind, but we'll hit a boat reasonably often. But at the end of the day, if our opponent bets once with a hand like king queen or something like that, or with a hand like, king nine suited or something like that, I think he's going to give up a lot on the turn in the river. So I like putting in the check raise now. It lets us get more value if we do have our opponent dominated, and it also doesn't give a bunch of free cards for us to be outdrawn. So advantages and disadvantages of check raising aces, but I think I would go ahead and check raise them. Tens, I think I would check raise as well. We're obviously going to be beat decently often when we have a hand like pocket tens. Our opponent will, make king jack or have pocket aces or pocket queens reasonably often, but it'll also have ace queen, and I don't love giving free cards with tens. So that's why I'm going to check raise them here. Check calling range. So I would just list everything we want to check call with. So ace queen is going to be 9. Going to have a lot of those. Ace jack is going to be 12. King queen is going to be 12. I'll put all this in after pausing it. Okay, so this was my first run through, and I have us defending 79% of our checks, which is a ton. And then I also noticed we only are checking 82 combos when I wrote 92, so I misread that. So it looks like I defended a few too many combos, but if you want to pause for a moment and look at this, you'll realize like all these combos seem very reasonable to defend. But if it does seem like we're defending a little bit too much, what we can do is just say, okay, so before I was check raise bluffing with like pairs and gut shots. Maybe now, 10-9 suited probably shouldn't be check raised because that's just a pair. So here, like we'll take off 10-9 suited since that hand's a little bit too weak. And maybe we'll also just check raise bluff with the open-ended straight draws. So put this down here. So doing something like that, that will have us now. So now we're check raising 13 combos and only defending 49 of our checks. So right there, that makes us go from defending 65 to 62, and that lowers our check defending frequency. And again, you can decide whether or not you think that's defending too aggressively. I think it seems reasonable enough. It's still a lot of checks that we're defending, but our opponent still has a really good chance of, outdrawing us because we're mostly defending by check calling, and there's a lot of coordination on this board. So something like this seems reasonable, and if we wanted to, we could fold, maybe the king 10 suited. Okay. So I am going to make at least another video with these exact ranges on this topic. I might even make more than another video because this is something I want to get better at, and I think this is something that's pretty hard to find good content on, so hopefully you enjoy watching this. But just based off this first go-through, I actually really like these ranges we're defending with. Obviously, I want to play around with them a little bit more. We might find out that we don't think we're defending it aggressively enough pre-flop, but this range seems very doable, and since I'm not opening the cutoff all that wide, and I am four-betting, these hands as well as some bluffs, I think we're defending our cutoff open a reasonable amount to a 3-bet. Remember, the blinds can 4-bet cold as well. So at a glance, I'm really liking these ranges a lot. I think one thing I've noticed, which I already kind of knew, is if we get an 8-high board or lower, we're really just screwed. That happens a lot in, single raise pots when we call a button open in the blind. Just really, really low boards tend to just whiff our range. Not a problem because the boards don't happen all that often. But for most boards, if there's 2 high cards, this range seems like it's doing great. And then if there's 1 high card, it's doing reasonably well. And the only time we're in really bad shapes is when there is no card that's higher than a 9. So I like this range a lot right now. I'll probably make another video on it. Obviously, this isn't a perfect range, but it seems like it's good after the first go through. Whereas for the blind defending ranges, you'll notice this experimental range tab right here. I have been tweaking a little bit more because I did find some problems with them, I think. Whereas with this range right now, I think it seems pretty good, so I'm going to play around with it some more. So thanks for watching, everyone. Hopefully you learned some stuff. I know you're not going to memorize what to do on board textures, and you can't solve for what's correct anyways, but hopefully you're getting a better feel for how to defend against 3-bets when you're out of position. And you're starting to get a feel for what boards hit the 3-betting range and what boards hit the 3-bet cold calling range. So even if you're not super precise, you have a better sense of, when you should check back as the 3-better and when you should be prepared to defend aggressively when you call it a 3-bet and when you should just be prepared to, check fold a lot because it missed your range. So thanks for watching, everyone. Hope you enjoyed it. Take care and good luck. Bye.